if you are the weirdo and you have found your tribe of weirdos, you have to get used to the idea that you will over time feel like almost all of your principles have been betrayed. For most of human history, to the extent that there was economic growth, it was really too slow for someone to even notice over their lifetime.
How do we escape stagnation and accelerate progress? And what if bubbles are good, actually? Just asking questions. I'm Zach Weissmuller, senior producer, Reason's associate editor. Liz Wolfe is here. Hey, Liz.
Hey, Zach.
They promised us flying cars. All we got was 140 characters. Those were the words of Peter Thiel over a decade ago, lamenting technological stagnation. The character limit has since increased, but his point remains the same. Innovation in the software world of bits has accelerated, but progress in the material world of atoms has been stubbornly slow, at least in his telling. Economist Tyler Cowen, who popularized the term Great Stagnation, argued that we picked all the low-hanging fruit in the early to mid-20th century thanks to cheap cultivation of unused land, mass educating a previously uneducated population, and revolutions in transportation, energy, and synthetic materials that could since be only marginally improved at increasingly greater expense and effort. The result has been stagnant wage growth when accounting for price inflation, and a failure to realize any revolutionary breakthroughs in energy, transportation, or materials science for decades. But today's guest says there's another underlying reason for the stagnation as well, a self-defeating cultural and spiritual malaise and pessimism about the future. It manifests itself in the kinds of dystopian movies and shows that dominate Hollywood, and the falling prevalence of words associated with progress in the future, and a rise of words associated with caution, worry, and risk found in contemporary literature. Byrne Hobart is co-author of Boom with Tobias Huber, Boom, Bubbles, and the End of Stagnation, which offers a surprising way out of this stagnation. Embrace the dynamic and chaotic power of bubbles. Investment bubbles, big social bubbles, filter bubbles. Some examples range from the big ambitious public investments like the Apollo missions and the Manhattan Project to the rise of Bitcoin. Byrne, thank you for coming on the show.
Hey, great to be here.
Let me first ask you about that graph I mentioned in the intro, analyzing the language shifts within English, German, and French literature. This is something you reference in your book. What kind of clue does that offer about our cultural moment?
Yeah, so progress does emerge from some kind of intellectual environment, some kind of social environment, like that you either have a lot of cues telling you that things can improve materially, or you have cues telling you that no, this is roughly the way things are, or even you can end up with a view that we had some golden age in the past and we can never recapture it, and the best we can do is slow the rate of decline. And of course, if that's your view, then anything new is probably worse. And so the best you could do is kind of keep things as similar as possible. And yeah, there I think also sometimes those trends in word usage, they're partly a leading indicator of what are the attitudes that people will have. They are partly a lagging indicator though of what has their experience been. And there are some domains where there has been just insane progress. Obviously, the software and the hardware it runs on has done incredible things over my lifetime. And then in other areas, there are these kind of isolated bursts of progress. So I think more recently, things like COVID mRNA vaccines were just an incredible achievement done in very quickly. And then GLP-1 agonists too are just again massive social change. Probably quite good. We don't know for sure, but my strong bias is that yeah, they're great. And going to have a very positive impact. But then in a lot of other areas, you see things like slowing life expectancy growth. You see things like just the physical products that you buy when you're using your marvelous new computer are just pretty similar to what was available before. Sometimes there is a greater variety and it's easier to find them, but we aren't really making that much new stuff, and we haven't really made abundant cheaper energy. We have reduce the energy intensity of a lot of things that we do regularly. So planes are more fuel efficient, cars are far more fuel efficient, et cetera. But that's just not nearly as radical a change as going from we don't have planes to we can fly, or going from we can travel by horseback or possibly train, or but mostly on foot, to we can drive pretty much anywhere we want. So those big transformative changes seem to be happening less and less in the physical world. And I think one way to turn around that initial question you asked of why have things slowed down is to say, well, maybe that is actually the default. And for most of human history, that was the
Good.
default. To the extent that there was economic growth, it was really too slow for someone to even notice over their lifetime. And if you didn't have a really really savvy econometricians millennium before your time, you would just have no idea that things had gotten marginally better. And you sort of see this acceleration that goes through stages where y- different various parts of the world, some of this was happening in China and India, some of this was happening in the Netherlands and northern Italy, that we start to have some low level kind of manufacturing that starts to get more and more productive. There start to be broader trade networks, and then things really kicked into gear with the Industrial Revolution. But when you look at the effects of the Industrial Revolution in terms of just the big macro factors that we can look at, a lot of it was that we found a new place where you could actually make fixed investments. You could take something that worked and scale it a bit, and then the actual increases in efficiency in output per hour were not that great. So a lot of the economic growth for the Industrial Revolution was that there were these profitable investments in railroads, and then a lot of the industries that were serving them. So things like steel and coal, and then a lot of industries that were downstream from them. So things like national brands and just manufacturing broadly. And but output per hour was not rising all that fast. It was just there was a category where there was a lot of room for more investments. And
Good.
in countries that kind of had a social contract or had economic arrangements that meant that a lot of the upside from those investments did accrue to shareholders rather than labor, that did also mean there was just a lot of capital that could be reinvested. And so a lot of that a lot of those networks, they started out fairly small and then expanded. And then you have this period from about the 1930s through the 1970s, where there is just a radical increase in output per hour, and pretty much everyone is benefiting. Rich
Good.
people are making more money, regular workers are earning more money, and there's more stuff for them to buy with the money they're making.
You talk a lot in this book, and a pretty substantial part of the thesis is that, people were taking on these massive projects, and you talk about the Apollo missions, you talk about the Manhattan Project. You have quite a few examples of basically pre 1970s government funded ultra ambitious projects. And now you're making the case that in the last 30 or 40 years, growth has majorly stalled. But I think lots of people would look at the gains within maybe not so much the realm of hardware, but certainly the realm of software and say, what are you talking about, Byrne? For the skeptic, how would you make the case to them?
So software has gotten better, and it feels like a lot of it kind of gets better at the pace at which hardware gets better, such that you have maybe more graphics, more flash and things like that, more flashy stuff on the interface. But the actual core products are not radical improvements. And a lot of the products that we've conceived of, like a lot of a lot of the popular software products today, like the core idea has been around for a very long time. And we've iterated and improved, and the computers have a lot more memory and they have more processing power, which allows them to, sometimes let you run Chrome and Slack and Notion on the same device and not have everything just slow to a crawl. And I think that if you looked at just the improvement in Moore's law and treated that as the rate at which computers improve, then you would also be pretty disappointed at the gap between modern computers and computers of, say, 20 years ago. That, yeah, they can do more things, but have we actually come up with additional useful things for them to do? And I think now there is a really good answer to this, which is that AI is very much a hardware comes in, data and hardware come in, and interesting novel answers to whatever random questions you have, or weird works of art that you request, that comes out. So we do see some progress there, but actually the AI thing is it feels very bubbly, and it has a lot of the traits that we identified in some of these other bubbly events.
Well, so I want to get into that. I mean, a huge part, I think this book could really be boiled down to financial bubbles are good, actually. And, bubbles are sort of wrongly maligned over and over again. Um, why is it that people malign bubbles? And are you a little bit I don't know, channeling Schumpeter or somebody here when basically saying like creative destruction can be really, really painful, but it's necessary pain. It's useful pain.
I think there's a sense in which Schumpeter has this kind of, you could call him like an economic reactionary, in that if he's talking about creative destruction, the
Mhm.
destruction element is there are old legacy institutions that no longer serve their purpose. And the good thing that financial ups and downs do is sometimes the downs are bad enough that they just kill off the worst performing institutions. And that's good. So it's this winnowing process where there's kind of like a random set of institutions, and some of them are just not good enough, and so we need some volatility to make sure that they are. It's sort of like, you slam on the brakes to see if anyone's wearing a seatbelt, and then you've done something a little bit healthy and pro-social, and it's better than the alternative of never checking and running into more serious problems. So there's a little bit of that, but I would say, like, one way to taxonomize different approaches to bubbles is, you can take a sort of strong efficient market hypothesis view of there is no such thing as a bubble. There is just investors' best guess as to what the present value of certain assets is, and that sometimes those guesses are wrong. But when people were buying houses at the peak of the housing bubble, they did assume these houses were good deals. They also assumed that the mortgage-backed securities, like the CDOs backed by subprime loans, were also good deals. That when people were investing in Pets.com or Dr. Coop or Space.com or whatever at the peak of the dot-com bubble, they were making their best guess as to what the right investment choice would be. So that is one way to look at it. Is just bubbles don't exist, but we do, uncertainty does exist, and sometimes it looks like a bubble in retrospect.
Hmm.
And then there is probably the default view, which is bubbles do exist and they're bad, and they, like, sometimes people stop thinking about fundamentals and start focusing on what is everyone else going to do and what is everyone else going to buy, and well, I don't understand why this thing is going up, but I feel like if I don't buy it now, then I'll be impoverished because it's clearly going to infinity. And so a lot of capital gets wasted, and the marginal dollar that goes into a bubbly sector towards the end of the bubble is going into something that is not very much worth doing. And then I think there's a sort of attempt to rehabilitate bubbles, which a book like Technological Revolution of Financial Capital would articulate, which is that what bubbles do is they pull forward a lot of fixed capital investment, and they make it happen maybe sooner than is really ideal, but it does actually happen. We do actually get utility from it. So when there's a railroad bubble, you do actually have railroads, even if you have more than you needed at the time. And if the economy is growing, then those railroads help it grow a little bit faster. Dot-com bubble is a really good example of this, where it's hard to imagine something like YouTube existing if people hadn't massively overbuilt fiber in the late 90s. And when they
Mhm.
overbuilt fiber, since fiber is one of those things where you have a fixed cost and then the marginal cost of delivering one more bit is zero, basically. So if you think that there's pretty much infinite demand for bandwidth, you want to own a lot of fiber. You want to build these fixed assets. And then the flip side of that is, if there's not infinite demand for bandwidth, if there's demand for, whether it's 90%, if there's demand for 90% of the capacity you built or 10%, the price tends to go to roughly zero in either case, because no matter what, there's someone else who wants to carry the same traffic, and they'd rather have the money from doing that than not, and their cost is low. But that all that fiber that was either built and underutilized or was not even in operation at all, um, organizations like Google did start buying it up in the early 2000s. They got a really good deal. And there was just a lot of cheap bandwidth, which meant that you could have a company like YouTube, where it is basically a couple guys who have, they're working in their apartment or have a small office. They don't have a huge amount of infrastructure. They haven't had to do giant deals with big telecom companies in order to get their stuff to customers. The bandwidth was cheap enough that they could build something like that. And at this point, bandwidth has, things have equilibrated a little bit more. So now you do have to think about bandwidth. But one of the reasons for that is that we all got used to the idea that you can at any time watch a streaming video, you can stream a video about basically any topic you want, and it's on demand. It's on pretty much any device. So we did manage to kind of spoil ourselves. So that's like the quasi rehabilitation of bubbles is, hey, we pull forward this investment, but the investment is still going to be useful eventually, and therefore it's fine. And in our book, what we try to articulate is this idea that it's not just pulling forward the investment. It's not just we would have built the fiber network maybe 10 years later or over the next decade, and so we would have gotten YouTube a little bit later. Our view is no, some of these investments, some of these things could not have possibly come to existence if there weren't a massive bubble. Because what you'll have is this feedback loop where different participants are each acting as if the other participants are pursuing some very ambitious plan, and that they're going to invest a lot in their piece of that plan. And if everyone has a fairly similar view of what the end state of the world looks like. They're all kind of aligned about the fact that they should make these investments, and all of these investments have complementarities between them such that each one raises the returns of the other ones, which is all really abstract. But like the concrete way to think about it is when AOL is thinking about whether or not to distribute lots and lots of disks and give people lots and lots of free trials of AOL, one of the things they're thinking about is, okay, how many things can people do online? Like, can people shop? Can they read the news? Can they check sports scores? Can they check stock quotes? And every time someone starts a service that makes those things more feasible, they actually increase the return that AOL gets from getting more people online. And at the same time, every time AOL gets more people online, Amazon is worth more, and E-Trade is worth more, and Yahoo is worth more. All of these companies are worth more. So everyone is kind of egging each other on, and they end up just resetting the growth of the entire sector to a much faster pace than it would have been. And we see this with
Yeah.
AI too, where, with the hardware, like hardware ambitions are a lot higher because the software ambitions have gotten a lot higher, and vice versa.
I mean, a fascinating aspect of your explanation in the book is the role that human psychology plays in this, and you talk about FOMO, fear of missing out, as really the driving force, one of the main driving forces of a bubble, and a very important one at that. Can you give a qualified defense of FOMO for us?
Yeah, yeah. So suppose it's, I don't know, 1995, and you've been a computer nerd for a very long time, and you've always been interested in this idea that computers can connect to other computers. They could talk to each other, and people could talk to each other through computers. And you've always wondered, does this change games? Does this change dating? Does this change news distribution? Does this change finance? Whatever it is. And then you hear about the Netscape IPO and you see the stock pop, and you have one instinct of saying, well, that was interesting. And then someone got there first, and this thing is now over. Like, everyone has figured out that networking computers together is a really, really big deal and will make someone a lot of money someday. And the other way to look at it is to say, no, this is getting started. And everyone is going to look at the Netscape IPO and ask, okay, what now makes sense in light of the value of a browser business? And they're not going to cover every single thing perfectly. And especially, they're going to have a hard time if they are just new to this. Like, they are a finance person. The first thing they heard about the internet was when they read the Wall Street Journal and saw news about an IPO on the front page. They are definitely behind someone who was into this stuff beforehand. So at that point, you might start to feel some FOMO. You realize one set of nerds made a ton of money. You're in the set of nerds that hasn't made any money, but you feel like you're about as nerdy as these other people. So give or take. So it should be you. And you feel like you're missing out. If you don't start your own internet thing, you might be missing out. And my view is, yeah, that is absolutely what you should fear. Like, this is the time when those things turn from a concept that people are noodling around with in their head to something you can actually raise money for and turn into a real business and turn into a profitable business. And you can shape the way these technologies are deployed and where they go, how people use them, how people think about them. So yeah, missing the thing you should fear the most is missing out.
No.
I'm curious though, are there examples where the collateral damage of a bubble outweighs all of the good done?
Yes, yes. In our taxonomy, and this is a rough guide and it is hard to implement in practice, but the way we think about it is that you can break bubbles into two categories, one of which is we're betting on a radically different future. It is nothing like what has come before, and you really can't imagine this future without taking the technology we're building seriously. And that describes .coms, that describes, say, electrification of factories, that describes the railroads, describes like a lot of, describes cars, like the end order impacts of cars are really crazy because they reshape cities, they reshape shopping, they reshape just how our built environment is shaped, and where human beings fit into the entire sphere of things that we have influence on. So pretty crazy, pretty big impact. And then you have another category of bubbles where they're just a little bit more about looking at the past and expecting the future to be pretty similar, but with a more and more narrow confidence interval. And for a lot of these bubbles, they have a lot more of a credit component to them because you are betting that the future is a continuation of the past. And so you think that that future is pretty good collateral to lend against. So the housing bubble would be a canonical example of that. The housing bubble did not start because someone built a really, really good robot that could build houses really fast. And it didn't start because we had, some marvelous new technology that made houses way better to live in. It was really that we had better pipelines for getting money into housing investments And then that created this feedback loop where housing prices were supported by the availability of credit to buy new houses, and so people were refinancing rather than defaulting on loans. And they were also generating a fair amount of economic activity, like mortgage withdrawals turned into consumption. They were like a low single-digit percentage of consumer spending at the peak of the bubble. So you had economic growth that looked a little bit better than it actually was, all predicated on this credit growth and the credit growth was predicated on the fact that the collateral behind it also looked like it's performing better than it really was. And as soon as there were any jitters anywhere in that system, it started unwinding pretty fast. And turned out that there were also a lot of those really, really hyper efficient financial pipelines for moving capital around were also really, really good at being completely shut off. And so that's like the subprime thing. It was in the news. People were worried about subprime in early 2007. That's when some of the early bankruptcies started. Housing prices peaked in 2006. The financial crisis was really when financial institutions realized they don't know who they can lend to, who will actually pay them back. And like if you have these really highly rated structured products that are backed by subprime loans, and you realize that it's like the default rates are higher, but also the correlation of default rates within one of these products is higher than you thought. You don't know if something that's AAA rated is actually going to pay off 100 cents on the dollar or 95 cents on the dollar. And if the standard is that someone can lever themselves up 30 to 1 buying these things, well, you don't want to be the person who lets someone lever up 30 to 1 and it turns out they lose 5% and their collateral was 3%. So you stop lending and suddenly the whole system seizes up.
Yeah, I mean, you trace a lot of the bad risk taking or the creation of bad bubbles back to Bretton Woods, or the collapse of Bretton Woods when we abandoned the gold standard or abandoned the ability to trade dollars in for gold. We had abandoned the gold standard long before that. But and I mean, what's your argument there is that we push normal people to invest more of their savings in the stock market, right? Because that was the only way to keep up for with inflation. Here's a little chart that kind of helps show what happened here. The red arrow I have pointing there to the closing of the gold window, and then you see a big run up in inflation that was then only pushed down in the 80s. So people were like looking for places to protect themselves against that. Um, on its face, that sort of system would seem to be good for bubbles because you are encouraging money to go into the stock market and inflate all sorts of things. But how did that actually encourage the bad kind of bubbles?
Yeah, so I have incredibly mixed feelings about this sort of pre-Bretton Woods and post-Bretton Woods world
Yeah.
because on the one hand, modern finance is pretty incredible and lots of fun, and gives a lot of smart people some really interesting things to do with their day, and definitely does tend to transfer money to a lot of those people, which is awesome. So I think it has some pro-social aspects. But one of the problems is that it does encourage a lot of people to spend a lot of time thinking about kind of the mechanics of money and how money moves around rather than thinking about the underlying real world economics behind what they're doing. So in this Bretton Woods period, you basically suppressed a lot of volatility in the banking system, and the world seems to often tolerate just a finite amount of volatility that you can shift around but not ever destroy. And when you shift that volatility around, real world volatility, like real world economic volatility, does sometimes take the form of depressions and booms and the cycle between the two. But it also takes the form of changes within industries and deployments of new technologies and things like that. So I think part of the view was just what the Bretton Woods system did was tell a lot of smart people that finance has been partly solved and you should
True.
just not spend that much time on it. Like it's not going to be all that interesting. And a lot of the cool things you can think of doing, we will just make rules against them because anytime you have this sort of rigid rules based system, when people find interesting edge cases and start exploiting them, that weakens the system. And there was a lot of that, especially towards the tail end of the Bretton Woods stuff, where you did have a lot of people who were figuring out different ways to speculate on gold, or they were figuring out that there were US dollars that were outside of the US financial system. And so you could use them as a means to speculate on things like interest rates. And the system was fraying for a long time before it actually collapsed. And it did just like once that system collapses, once currencies can fluctuate and once money can move more freely, it does mean that there's just a lot more stuff that you can do that does entirely involve moving these abstractions around and not doing
Mhm.
anything especially concrete. I don't know how much that directly fed into the software boom, but certainly it's hard to imagine modern finance without Excel. It's hard to imagine some forms of modern finance without FPGAs and people rewriting all the standard libraries of C++ to make them slightly faster and more efficient, and really cheap data storage, and lots of techniques for turning through that data and finding these tiny, tiny aberrations that you can exploit, et cetera. So there is a little bit of a feedback loop there, and you can view these as all kind of part of this same phenomenon, this shift of attention away from the tangible and real and towards interacting with these abstractions.
But what about, I mean, you talk in there a little bit about, low time preference and people thinking along longer and longer time horizons. And you seem to be making the case that there's a relationship there between, you not having a really reliable savings tool in the US dollar, and that you can just predict it's going to lose its value by the time you retire or whatever, and the willingness to kind of withhold until you see the right thing. I mean, how does that sort of allocation of money play into your theory of making productive bubbles and not just, beanie baby bubbles or whatever?
Right. I think it's just when you have more ways for money to move around, it can chase these more speculative and kind of more self-referential things. And if you do constrain that, then really the only way to get some kind of wild speculation that just causes a torrent of capital pour into a single industry is for that industry to, in some sense, deliver the goods.
Yeah.
So, a lot of capital moved into the US residential real estate business. Again, not because of these fundamental and not because of any kind of fundamental underlying economic change, but because it was just really easy for capital to move. And we
Yeah.
had this weird imbalanced system where, we replaced a system where gold is in theory the store of value and the global reserve currency, but really everyone interacts with the dollar, with a system where the dollar itself is that reserve. And that does force other countries to accumulate dollars. And there were there was this set of exporters who, in the late '90s and especially in the early 2000s, just ran massive trade surpluses with respect to the U.S., which is partly a function of they were selling either oil in the case of oil exporters or manufactured goods in the case of China. But also, the system really only balances out. Like if everyone is using dollars all the time, and if say Saudi Arabia and China use dollars in bilateral trade with non-US countries because everyone can agree on what the dollar is worth and everyone can move a dollar around and people can't necessarily come to the same kind of agreement on other currencies. If you have a setup like that, countries need to accumulate dollars as they grow. They need to accumulate dollar-denominated assets because they will need to make good on the money that they owe in dollars, and they need different economic actors within their country to be able to source dollars. They just don't
Mm.
want to have a shortage of hard currency, and to do that, to make that equilibrate, you do need the U.S. to run a pretty substantial trade deficit. So it set up a really really weird system where you have things like really high savings rates in poorer countries and really low savings rates in the richest country. And it's supposed to go the other way around. It's supposed to be that countries get rich and they run out of local investment opportunities, but the rest of the world is poorer. And so the things that exist in the US, you can kind of copy them and invest, you can invest in those, copy them and scale them up somewhere else. But you tend to see basically the opposite of that.
Yeah, and I mean the counter reaction to that has, or the reaction to that has been Bitcoin. I mean, Bitcoin has been the attempt to recreate sound money in a way, or recreate money that doesn't lose its value over time. That's the selling proposition of it anyway. And you have an entire chapter devoted to Bitcoin, as because Bitcoin has gone through several what you might call manias. We can look here at the price history of Bitcoin and see like the huge run up and then giant fall and then a big run up again, a slightly smaller fall. Like what could we just look at this for a second as a case study in your theory of bubbles? Like how did each of these bubbles within Bitcoin make it a more substantial and lasting product? It's to the point to today, it's hitting new all-time highs. It went over 100,000 for the first time a week or so ago.
Yeah. So one of the reasons that we had a chapter on Bitcoin is that it is much more of a pure bubble phenomenon. There's just a lot. There's a lot. There are a lot more ways to get carried away, and it's much harder to put a value on Bitcoin other than that someone else is going to value it at some higher number in the future, and so that's really what you're betting on. And that is just, it's generally true of currencies. It's just a lot, like you can think of a currency as a sort of controlled, continuous bubble where you do have an irrational buyer. They're willing to overpay for something that is otherwise just, a worthless blend of stuff with some fancy drawings on it. And that buyer is the IRS. And their deal is like every year they will buy a bunch of US dollars from you in exchange for not putting you in jail. And that's a really good deal. Like you should definitely take that deal every time they offer it to you.
Great deal at twice the price, in my
Right.
opinion, since I'm not really
So,
a fan of, like, prison food, unfortunately.
yeah. So what they're doing there is kind of engineering this bubble where you can say, I look at these green pieces of paper and they're just not that aesthetically appealing. Like I don't want to stack up a just arbitrarily large number of them for any reason other than I know I can just foist these on some dumb buyer in the future, and that buyer's the IRS. But then I also know, well, if I sell these to someone else, perhaps in exchange for goods and services, they will value it for the same reason that they can foist it on the IRS. So you have someone who's basically constantly pumping that market in a way that maintains its value. And Bitcoin ended up achieving a weird quasi equilibrium where you don't actually need a buyer of first resort who is always going to have a bid under the asset and is always going to keep the price elevated. You just have a group of people who um, agreed with their money that yes, this is actually worth something. And yeah, Bitcoin bubbles have this interesting speculative feedback loop where when they when they start moving up, you do start to see people trying to build real world applications on Bitcoin or on other cryptocurrencies, and you see people trying to actually use them for real world transactions. And then as things keep going, you actually switch to a more purely financial bubble where the really exciting financial products being built with crypto are products that allow you to either borrow against your crypto in order to buy more crypto, or that automatically provide liquidity for crypto trading, which is actually an interesting dynamic that has shown up in emerging markets that have strict currency controls or have some level of financial regulation. What tends to happen sometimes, and this was like a big feature of the Southeast Asia economic bubble and then crisis of the late 90s, was at first there was genuine economic growth. So these countries were manufacturing exporters. They were exporting more every year. They were still their labor costs were very competitive with, let's say, Japan and Korea. And so you could bet that they were growing. And so outside money started flowing in. And as that money flowed in, it meant that more economic growth was either in the financial system or was things like building new airports, building new hotels, building fancy restaurants, all so that the Western bankers and hedge fund managers who were in town to visit their investments could have a really good time. And after a while, a lot of the manufacturers started getting priced out of the labor market. They just couldn't compete with construction and with service jobs in the capital city. And so you have this economy where it's growing and it's getting capital inflows, and that growth is it's more than 100% due to the capital inflows. So the capital inflows are just predicated on the capital inflows continuing. They didn't continue forever, and there were just a bunch of economic disasters in that part of the world, kind of one domino after another. So crypto, I think, goes through those same kinds of cycles, and that's just something that crypto people have to kind of get used to. But what they should remind themselves of is that if they were in crypto because it was the fastest way to 10x their money, they either got that or they learned their lesson. But if they're in it because they like the idea of this permissionless system for exchanging value with arbitrary third parties, whether they be human or machine, and with being able to have this global infrastructure for determining shared truths that basically nobody can alter or tamper with, like if they view that as a genuine public good and as a really cool concept and something they want to work on and contribute to, a lot of the people they don't like in crypto will just not be hanging around after the next downturn. But if you do find that the marginal buyer of crypto, like when you go to a crypto conference, if you find that people are wearing nicer suits and they're driving fancier cars and they're talking about price action and not about the not about use cases, you could take a little money off the table and get your coins back later when all of those people are back to investing in cannabis or GPT wrappers or whatever they find next.
I am curious though. I mean, some of the promises of Bitcoin so far haven't been borne out. I'm thinking about the degree to which you sort of need to build things on top, like via Lightning Network, in order to actually make it so that transactions can process even semi quickly in order to be legitimately useful. Or I'm even thinking about how, quite a few years ago, the promise was that Bitcoin would be extremely useful for remittances in third world countries. And we've seen a little bit of that, to be clear, but we haven't seen, I think, nearly the amount of that that people really anticipated. um, does this lend credence to the idea that it's bubbly and hyped, or does this just lend credence to the idea that these things take a long time to build and there are lots of people building in parallel? And the fact that there's so much investment in this just means that that will happen more quickly than if it weren't as hyped.
Yeah, so I think, I guess like 10 years ago, I would have said, yeah, just give it time. But we gave it time. And yeah, it doesn't look like Bitcoin itself is the right thing for consumer facing applications. But it's also true that there is room for a store of value whose goal is not to be consumer facing at all.
Hmm.
And where it's actually it's a weird edge case or a weird bug if consumers are using this directly as a transactional medium.
So
And
you're
so
allowing Zach to have more and more air gapped weird crypto wallets in his house. This is
Hey,
bullshit.
let's not talk about that in public.
Yeah, I don't want to accidentally put a target on Zach's back over here. Zach has nothing to hide.
yeah,
So,
it's so
but you're saying there's value, like it's that we misconceived of what Bitcoin was, basically.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot more sense as a gold substitute in the gold standard era. The way that gold standard was not that everyone's getting paid entirely in gold coins, and that when you buy a cup of coffee, like you use a gold coin. Like you need a very tiny gold coin and a very, very accurate scale in order to directly transact in gold. Instead, the idea was you have banks that are indirectly backed by a central bank that has this big store of gold, and the central bank is injecting credit into the economy, and that credit is backed by gold. So you can, if you don't trust the Bank of England anymore, you can redeem your note for gold. Or if you are doing some kind of international trade and you need to net out your assets and liabilities, maybe you do sell something for local notes locally, turn that into gold, ship the gold back to France or Germany or Spain or wherever, and you close out the transaction. And having an asset like that where it's what's backing a lot of balance sheets, but it's not actually what people are transacting with, does mean that local banks have some flexibility. They can expand and contract credit roughly in line with demand. But if they overshoot, what happens, and this is historically how the business cycle worked, was they issue too much credit, so people start consuming more stuff, but they're not producing that much more stuff, so they have to consume more imports. And so as they're consuming more imports, the way for that to balance out is for gold to flow out of the country. And so eventually people start to look at how levered the bank is, like what is the ratio of gold notes to actual gold, and they start redeeming. And then what you pretty much have to do is contract credit, like raise rates, like make sure that people are not doing that, and basically induce a recession that normalizes the import and export balance. So in a system like that, you tend to have over time pretty flat balances of trade with a lot of local fluctuation that's based on local circumstances.
Mm.
So it's, when a country starts exporting more, they run a surplus, but that means they're piling up lots of gold. So they increase local liquidity, increase local purchasing power, and people start buying more imported goods, and it all balances out.
Yeah, I mean, and another, just to linger on Bitcoin for another minute before we move on to talk about some other bubbles. It's a fascinating case study because there's the financial bubble aspect of Bitcoin, and then there's the social bubble of Bitcoin, which you also talk about in the book, and which Liz and I have experienced firsthand. We went to Bitcoin Miami and did a little documentary there.
They
It's funny
tried
you're
to
talking about.
proselytize us. They tried to turn us away from Jesus Christ and toward
That's right.
our Lord and
Yeah,
Savior Satoshi.
yeah, and it's funny because you talk about the suits show up during the boom cycles, then they disappear. When we were there, it was sort of on a down cycle, and some of the hardcore people were like, "Oh, we're grateful that they're all just investing in AI now," because that was the new bubble then, because now we can build we can build more cheaply on top of Bitcoin or whatever, and what we noticed though was that there was definitely a strong, almost like a schism between different sects of Bitcoiners. There's famously the Bitcoin maximalists. There was even a gallery of Bitcoin artwork. I'm going to play just a short clip from our documentary to show people what we're talking about, and then I'd love for you to comment on what it means that there's like a quasi religion at the core of Bitcoin.
Walking around the conference, all of the elements of the Bitcoiners' creed were on full display, which Nick Carter says has turned into a religion. It has its own heroes, icons, doctrines, saints, and heretics. Most of the religious imagery present at the conference was shrouded in irony, but as with so much of digital life, it was hard to tell where the joke ended. Ronald Reagan once courted the religious right, but in 2023, a parade of once and future presidential contenders made the trek down to Miami to pander to the Bitcoiners. Former Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard showed up.
Once we give up our economic autonomy, we give up our freedom.
Along with long-shot presidential candidate Vivek Ramaswamy.
Freedom of speech and freedom of money are two sides of the same coin.
So, yeah, what is the value of having those true believers or that social bubble that is in terms of bootstrapping progress?
Yeah, so they're like it's convenient that we use the term filter bubble to describe a bunch of people who are in an echo chamber where you only encounter people who share that opinion, because it is a kind of bubble, and what it does is it ratchets up how seriously people take these ideas. And that's very much for better or for worse. And you can see like a lot of political movements start with this group of people who completely isolate themselves online and will only talk to people who completely agree with them. And then they just get more and more and more extreme. And it feels like in my lifetime, various strains of libertarianism have gone through this many, many times in many different directions, and certainly there's a lot of this on the progressive side as well. And you can see this in politics with a lot of you can see it in like conservative politics with people who are really, really, really MAGA in a way that does not entirely comport with facts on the ground. And so yeah, it is just part of human nature. But if the thing that unites your group is something where you are actually onto something, then you do want people to take a little bit farther, because you are early in this explore exploit process, and you want to explore as far along the lines that you started on as you can. And I think that's a lot of what happened with crypto. Like in the early days, people were talking about this as pretty much the end of central banks, or they were talking about this as this is what money should have been all along. And if we had computers before we had money, we would have had Bitcoin and never had anything else. And I think a lot of that was, it turned out not to be true, or if it is true, it's taking a very long time to play out. But it was true that there were a lot of applications that you wouldn't really want to build something like Coinbase if you thought that crypto is this really fun speculative tool and you can use it to buy pizza as a joke, and that's all it does. Or even if you said, hey, crypto is something that allows you to transfer value within different countries, but it doesn't touch the formal banking system, so it's a really good way to sell drugs. Crypto, like Bitcoin at least, is probably the worst way to sell drugs in the world, because the connection between the fiat off and on ramps is very closely monitored.
It's a
And
public
blockchain
ledger.
is always there. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's that is not a good use case for it, as it turns out, but it was initially one of the reasons that there was actual underlying demand for Bitcoin. I think there was 1 year where I think Bitcoin prices had a run up in advance of Burning Man, and then collapsed after all of the tech savvy drug users were offline for a few days.
I hate
So
every part of that sentence. Like, that makes me wanna throw my phone in the ocean
I
and,
love
like,
it.
take my child and run to the woods.
I mean, a lot of technologies, look at what people use the internet for really early. Actually, one of the first e-commerce, I think the first known e-commerce transaction was also a drug sale. So you also have to reject Amazon and all its works if you're going to take that, if you're going to be sufficiently doctrinaire there. Like it is true, like a lot of these technologies, they attract a really, really weird group of people early on. If you look at say in the Apollo program chapter, we talk about some of the completely insane people who were involved in the early days of rocketry. You had people who were really into the occult and died in rocket explosion accidents in California. And then you have Germans who are just really into hobbyist rocketry, and then they start using slave labor to construct rockets to attack civilians in London during World War II. Like there are very high variance people who get in early to fields that turn out to be really important. And you should always assume, like, especially if you are one of those high variance people, like if you are the weirdo and you have found your tribe of weirdos, you have to get used to the idea that you will over time feel like almost all of your principles have been betrayed.
So
And go ahead.
oh, no, go ahead. Continue.
So when we talked about the kind of religious dimension of Bitcoin, and we do talk a bit about religion throughout the book, which was not intended. Like, it was originally supposed to be more of a straightforward history and finance and economics and technology kind of book, and then we ended up kind of through discussing it as we were writing different chapters, ended up coming on this more abstract and serious dimension. So one of the things that Bitcoin has in common with a lot of very successful religions and a lot of successful institutions that last for a long time is you have a founder who has this incredible impact. You like the institution could not have existed without this founder. They wrote down a lot of what they believed. They answered a lot of people's questions live before the thing was really a thing, before it was really big and significant. And then
Mm.
they disappear at a conveniently early time. And after that, you have everything they said. That's part of the canon. You know that that is what they believed. And everything beyond that is a matter of interpretation. And this shows up in history. You have things like obviously Christianity and other religions where you have a founding figure. We have a lot of we've written down a lot of the things that their followers say that they said, so we know what the canon is, and then we all have to figure out, okay, which part was literal, which part was figurative, and how do we interpret this, and does this mean there's an institution, or does this mean that we're all interacting with the text, etc. And ancient Rome had that too, where they have this legendary figure of Romulus, where he creates, starts building the city, and he has the twin brother who jokingly steps over the wall, and then Romulus murders him, and that tells the Romans that no one is allowed to invade Rome. And then towards the end of the Romulus narrative, there is he's sitting on his throne talking to his advisors. There's a sudden storm, no one can see anything, and then when the storm dissipates, Romulus is gone.
Mm.
And that's really convenient because it means you can't ask Romulus what he thinks after that. You just have to go by what he said, and that it is just it's like a useful design pattern for getting groups of people to agree on things, is that you get the founder is not participating after a while, so you can't leverage your connection to the founder. You can't ask the founder if how things turned out is disappointing. You just have to assume based on what they said. And so that has created this dynamic where there are different people who are interpreting what Satoshi said, interpreting the white paper, interpreting the original source code, and all the forum comments and emails and things. And then you have schisms where they are taking some of the underlying principles and building something else. And we can be as wildly offensive as we want in our heads and discuss like which real world phenomena correspond to that, taking the religious analogy, etc. But like it is a normal pattern of human behavior that you have these founding events, and then things riff on them, and things riff on that, and we all sort of find our cluster of people with whom we agree, and that ends up being a high trust cluster where you can actually extend your ideas further if you are surrounded by people who all think roughly the way you do, but who are also all human beings. Like, we all have slightly different opinions on things and slightly different personalities, and so you want a little bit of randomness in the mix, and that's what you get.
One of my favorite themes of this book was how frequently you hit on the note of risk aversion, and how society appears to be getting a lot more risk averse over time. I think about this a lot because I think I'm a little bit more of a risk seeker than a lot of people in the sort of cohorts that I operate in. And so I think about this a lot. But Byrne, like, how do you quantify whether we actually have gotten societally more risk averse in the last few decades? Like, make the case to me that we really are as risk averse as you say.
Yeah, so I think Tyler Cowen did a better job of this in his book than I did. But I think it's the complacent class where
Take a
he has a
risk
lot
and
of.
try to beat Tyler, you know?
Yeah, okay. So I think there's a lot of there's a lot of statistical evidence of things like people living fairly close to home, people just not taking big financial swings. I think like really the thing that I would point to is that there are these kind of elite career tracks that are pretty well defined in advance, and actually the more elite the career track is, the easier it is for someone at 18 to know exactly what they will be doing, what their job title will be, and what city they'll live in when they're like 35. And that's just totally dysfunctional. Like, if those people are in fact the best, they should have no idea what they end up doing. I'm towards the end of the Ron Chernow biography of Alexander Hamilton, and he's one of those people who is just like clearly one of the great talents of his age. And, for a while he works for a merchant, and then he starts writing, and then he's academic briefly, but then a war starts. And so then he becomes a soldier, and then he's a politician. And then, he's bouncing back and forth between all these different worlds. Sometimes he does other things that are regrettable on his part. There's no one who he did not live in a world where people knew, okay, young Alexander, you seem to be balancing the books quite well. I bet you will be George Washington's assistant soon, and will probably be leading soldiers into battle at some point. And then no one would be able to say to him at 20, like, Mr. Hamilton, you're doing a really good job with military logistics, and when the time comes and you're leading a charge, you lead that charge perfectly well. I think you'd be a pretty good Treasury Secretary for a new country, which, by the way, doesn't exist yet. And when it comes into existence, we'll have to have its existence revised with your help, because the original version of it is totally dysfunctional. Like, none of that was predictable. And it meant that you could have someone who's born kind of in the middle of nowhere, has no social standing whatsoever, and rises right to the top. And now, we don't really have like a social norm of, if your parents weren't married when they had you, you are just completely cut out from society. But in other ways, a lot of things do seem pretty defined by the time someone gets their SATs, and even a lot of the other components of their college application are going to be baked in well before that. And it seems like you shouldn't have an elite where it's really, really predictable what they will be doing with their lives. And so you have two possibilities, one of which is those people, like, we have kind of reached some end of history point where we do pretty much know what has to get done, and we have a multi-decade lead time in deciding who should be working on which particular tasks, like who's going to be a good neurosurgeon, who's going to be a good lawyer, who's going to be a good congressman, whatever. Or the other possibility is they're not actually the elites. They're something else. They're like a useful professional class, and the people I'm talking about are all pretty uniformly smart, conscientious, helpful, etc. You do want a lot of them in your important institutions doing important things, but if they haven't had to make a meaningful decision since really, I don't know, it feels like a lot of them, they don't make that many meaningful decisions in their lives. And so you don't want to put them in a position where they have to make a lot of meaningful decisions for everybody else. You want to have some system where there are ways which have to be defined after the fact. Like, you have to be able to look at someone's success in a domain that you did not know existed until they had their great success in it, and then say this person should be doing this other thing. So you
It
can
sounds
actually,
like
go ahead.
it sounds like you just hate McKinsey consultants. Is that correct?
I have gotten along great with every McKinsey consultant I've ever interacted with. They are uniformly smart. They are very curious. They
But
know their
I
stuff.
but I am like, that sort of that joke sort of disguises a deeper point, which is like, is this risk aversion just something that happens the wealthier and sort of like more comfortable we get as a society? Like,
I would say
this is
it
a
happens.
luxury that we have, the ability to be risk averse. And we sort of see this happening in lots of societies that have the same trend line, right?
I would say it happens at the peak. So yes, you can be rich enough and kind of stable enough that you can afford to make these really long-term promises. But if you look at previous eras where people had very long-term defined careers, I think the peak of that in terms of just the number of people who could participate would have had to be 1950s manufacturing jobs at big three automakers, where you pretty much knew if you got the job at Ford, or you got the job at the Chevy plant, you could predict what your wage progression would be until you retired. You also knew you were retiring early, and you didn't have to worry about healthcare. You knew that was going to be covered too. Um, and that turned out to be, really great for the generation that got it. Some of that did come at the expense of the entire ecosystem of suppliers around those companies. So, if GM is not going to fire anyone during a layoff, but fewer people are buying cars during a layoff, like, somebody's job is going to go. It's probably the company that sells, I don't know, that sells seatbelts to GM, that they have to fire half their people. And by the way, they weren't paying them nearly as much as GM was. So, um, for those systems to work, like, the total amount of volatility in the world doesn't change all that much, but it can be shifted around. So if you have a cohort of people who have a very, very clear shot to some outcome, then the residual volatility has to exist somewhere else in the system. So, I do tend to think that that kind of thing, it has to be temporary. It has to be something that works for a while and then stops working. And that if you find yourself in a position where you can predict your future really, really well, and where there's this series of high stakes events in your future, but every one of them, it's a really high stakes decision by some authority figure to decide whether or not you fit into a predefined category. then you're probably doing something with a finite half-life and should really reconsider.
One of the things that I was most fascinated by with this book, because you spend a considerable amount of time talking about the Manhattan Project, and especially some of the spillover technologies that were developed as a result of that really interesting group of people getting together. But you also talk a lot about the Apollo missions. And one of the components that really, I want to get to the Apollo missions a little bit more in a bit, but one of the components that really stuck out to me was that you were talking about how there's almost something about ultra religious people or people with some sort of like religious sensibility, some sort of devout belief that seems to actually, I think, contra popular narratives. It lends itself well to scientific exploration and specifically space exploration. And you talk about, I think it was Apollo
Oh.
15 that had a particularly high concentration of religious people going up into space. You also talk just about some of the interesting, I mean, the reading of Genesis, right? When I believe it was the first walking on the moon. Could you sort of detail like what is it that you kept finding over and over again about religious people and space? Is there a religious
Yeah.
activity here for space?
I mean, and it even goes back, like, Newton was also extremely religious, and religious in a really, really weird way, and so I think that basically Newton saw it was, okay, God creates the universe, God creates people, he gives us really big brains, and the idea of giving us all really big brains is not just hoping that we won't commit the sin of using those brains to understand creation. No, that we're actually expected to understand creation and that it all exists, but also that God is not a hack. God is not lazy and or doesn't take shortcuts, doesn't do dumb stuff. That if you have theories that explain a lot with very little input, that those are actually a reflection of, and you can view this in a totally secular context. You could say like reality is this very complicated and elaborate result of a fairly simplistic set of rules. You have a small set of rules, you add a random seed, and you get the universe. I think those views do kind of converge, where maybe from a more purely secular standpoint, you are talking about the elegance of some theory, and that your general bet is that if you have an elegant theory that appears to explain the data, and then you have a really complicated, kind of messy theory that does fit the data better, that your best guess is, maybe even from just an information theory standpoint, your best guess is that your clumsy kind of hacky theory is just overfitting on the data you have, and the new data you get will probably fit the more elegant one better. And that has been the right bet to make for pretty much all of scientific history. And so, yeah, I think the question of why space in particular, like why are they focused on really big things that are really far away? Why is there not this huge religious dimension to designing chips? Although there is some of that too. There was a fun article in Wired a couple months ago that I think the headline was something like "I saw the face of God in the semiconductor factory," and it was just about how most of the objects that have ever been built by humans are transistors. That is most of, in terms of just a strict count of units, that is most of what humans have done for all of our history, is build lots of these really tiny things that you can use to rapidly execute logical operations without any moving parts. Um,
Well,
but space is just, it is like a good symbol of transcendence. And when you talk about like there are like the religions that are more monotheistic, they like I guess one way to think of it is like you can there are a lot of older religions that are very polytheistic, like the Greek and Roman kind of household god system, where you think that your ancestors are divine and that they continue to exist underground where you buried them, and their spirits are there and care about what's going on. So God is down that way. And then you can have like a God is like right in front of us. There is a Messiah walking around, and we can see that Messiah. But then if you have a more abstract monotheistic religion and you don't have very many prophets walking around on the earth today, you tend to look upward when you're looking for where is God, where do we go after we die, etc. So yeah, that is just generally the direction that religious people are more inclined to look.
but because I'm obsessed with the Apollo stuff that you were talking about in your book, like for those who haven't read that chapter, can you just give like a 60-second rundown of all of the ways that like religion kept cropping up over and over again and seemed to be this huge motivator for the astronauts?
Yeah, so I think one of the really interesting ones was Werner von Braun, where he was the rocket scientist I alluded to. I believe he was not personally held responsible for slave labor used to make the rockets that were launched at London, but he was definitely helping design the rockets that were launched at London. And then after the war, he and a lot of his compatriots decided they were definitely going to get captured by somebody, and they really preferred there to be the Americans. So swept up and moved to the United States, and then he ends up in what I think must have just been this incredibly psychologically complicated situation where he he was born with these talents, and then he cultivated these talents as a rocketry hobbyist, and then he used these talents in defense of something just truly appalling and evil, and he's still around, and people are expecting him to do something for the world. And I think just dealing with that psychologically, you have to you want to find some kind of belief system that puts that in context and tells you something about what to do next, and really tells you how to avoid making the same mistake that you made before. And so he became a very evangelical Christian, and or he became a Christian of a fairly evangelical mold, and did talk about humanity's destiny being to go to the stars. And I think taking taking something, there are a lot of stories within Catholicism, and I think stories of just people's personal experiences where they take some aspect of their personality that was a more a darker one, and they turn it around and make that part of the way that they express their positive pro-social religiosity. And actually, there are enough precedents of this. It goes back far enough that it happens in the Bible, where Saul/Paul is a cop, and he's able to wield the authority of the state, and then after his conversion he's still willing to do that. He's still willing to periodically pull out his I am a Roman citizen card at times that are very much to his advantage as someone who's evangelizing. So it's the traits don't actually go away. They just get transmuted into something that is pro-social. And I think if you are a believer, you don't think that God kind of gave you this personality as a prank or just to punish you. Like, you have to assume that of your traits, your traits have good and bad elements to them, but you are not going to totally change your personality if you change your religious outlook. You're going to express that personality in a very different way.
Hmm.
I
So I
mean,
think that's, for von Braun, like, you could say, like, the entire arc of von Braun's career is, he started out, shooting a rocket from this hill to that hill, and then shooting a rocket from Germany to London, and he realized that the right choice was actually to aim much higher.
a modern variant that I am increasingly seeing when we think about space and religion, or even more broadly, cutting edge technology and religion, is this sort of almost techno religion that seems to be emerging. I would say Elon Musk is probably an adherent to it. He's always talking about the simulation, and it's in a sort of joking way, but maybe not. And just the way he talks about our need to go into space and like spread human consciousness into the stars, it does have a spiritual wrapper to it. And certainly, what one thing that your book really brought home to me is just what's key to these bubbles is a shared narrative. And it made me realize that that is one of Elon Musk's key core skills. Is he is a shaper of grand narratives, whether it is we need to spread our consciousness to Mars, to the stars, starting with Mars, or we're facing an existential risk with climate change, so we need emissions free cars, but then also we're going to transform the entire transport system in a way that is going to be cool and fun. I mean, with Mars, there's that same dichotomy where like we need the backup planet in case something goes catastrophically wrong, but also there's this optimistic vision. And it also brought home to me like maybe this is why he bought X, because if you want to be purveying narratives that advance your vision of the future, that's a pretty good investment, whether it's a moneymaker or not. But I guess the concern that rises in my mind then is that, okay, we can have people out there spinning these really inspiring narratives and getting people to buy into them, but it's not necessarily married to the reality. It's not married to the reality of whether electric vehicles are going to be the thing that stops climate change, or whether the government needs to pour a bunch of money into developing the particular kind of technology that Elon Musk wants to see developed. What is the prudent way, do you think, to look at that situation, recognizing both the power of that to, to create some forward momentum and progress, but also the danger of just perpetuating something that is kind of a waste of time and money based on a false premise.
Yeah, I think, to the point about risk aversion, like, you should definitely go into any of these things accepting the possibility that you could be completely wrong and you could
Yeah.
be wasting your life. But also that if you didn't chase after these kinds of dreams, then you're pretty guaranteed to waste your life in some sense. So, it's just a question of, do you wanna do the high agency or low agency way of wasting it? Those are the worst case scenarios either way. Um,
Mhm.
I I do think, yeah, Musk is very good about putting together these narratives. Um, I I have this suspicion that one of the reasons that that you do see this more religious element to these sometimes is that religion, whether or not any given religion is true, it has at least survived a lot of kind of a Darwinian selection process where it causes the people who believe in it to have kids, raise those kids in that faith, and not have trouble with adjacent groups. And that can take a lot of different forms, and it also has a lot of variability in terms of how do religions persist and to what extent do they thrive despite persecution by different groups. But it is true that like any religion that's been around for a long time has just been through a lot of things and has prevailed over those things. And so it probably has norms that are going to also be pretty durable and are going to survive. And so you always want to ask if you are rejecting some of those norms, like like you may be smart, but are you smarter than a few thousand years of history
Yeah.
collectively? And often the answer is no. Um, and there are often ideas that feel really new and novel, and then you read about some random historical period and realize that someone else had exactly the same thought 500 years ago, and they did their thing and everybody starved, or they did their thing and started a war with a neighboring group and got wiped out or whatever. So it is, yeah, you're kind of free riding on just pure evolution when you try to adhere to those norms, whether or not you're actually a believer.
Hmm.
Are you a closeted pronatalist?
Am I a what?
Closeted pronatalist.
Closeted?
I
I
guess
have
you have
4
4
kids.
kids. You're not so closeted
Here, let's pull up the
after all.
total fertility rate, everybody.
And can
There
you
it
plot where
is.
Byrne is on that chart in terms of replacing no, but,
He's
do
back in the
you
1960s, right?
well,
Yeah.
I think that this was kind of an interesting theme though, in the book, which was that you are basically talking, over and over again about this idea that, maybe we don't have like there are possibly existential threats that are here, but it's almost like the existential threats nowadays are more subtle. It's like one of the great animating things. You talked for a long time about the threat of the communists ruling space and the red moon as a major motivator for developing the Apollo program, and about how there was almost this like jointly agreed upon shared sense of threat. And the US government then was able to pour a lot of investment into developing the Apollo program. And it kind of feels like today we almost like don't all converge around figuring out what exactly the existential threats that face us are. Like either that means we don't have existential threats, they don't exist, or we're struggling to communally identify what they actually are and thus coordinate to be able to solve them. At least in the circles that I run in, it seems like fertility rate is a huge thing. And you kind of gesture to that over and over again in the book. Am I correct in identifying that as like an existential threat in the Byrne Hobart theory of the world?
Yeah, yeah. So one of the ways that we ended up thinking about existential risk is that it always exists in the sense that anytime you have a society that runs in a certain way, an economy that runs in a certain way, you have some resources that are finite, some that are renewable, and then you have some resources where their availability fluctuates, and over time there will be some fluctuation that's larger than it was before, and so you always need to be prepared for a slightly worse than the previous worst case scenario. But also, just every year we have used slightly more of the oil and gas on this planet, and it was whatever was easiest to access this year. So the next thing, the next hole we drill in the ground is in a slightly less convenient place with maybe a little bit less of the relevant resource underneath. And so yeah, there's always this sort of low energy, tepid kind of doomsday that we're approaching. And as those finite resources start to get more expensive and as their cost gets more salient, then the next finite resource that we start drilling through and extracting is just social trust. It's just the view that things are going to work out okay, that you can generally trust other people in your society to do things that are not actively harmful to you, and that we're all kind of pulling in the same direction. When the economy is growing and when people feel like their kids will have a better life than they do, that's generally how everyone behaves. Even if they have these disagreements about the narrow implementation, they tend not to feel like the other side is just out to get them. But once you feel like the other side is out to get you, if you're right, then it's right for you to be out to get them. So you end up with this equilibrium where actually both sides are extremely hostile to one another and do not want to hear what the other side has to say, and you destroy a lot of that well of trust. So um, economic growth, it is this way to find new elites, find talented people, because there's not an existing rubric. Like, we don't actually have a list of what makes someone a really, really good AI company CEO, because we just don't have that many. And so it's you have a short list of people and say, be like that person, or do something that you think, or be someone whose strengths happen to be strengths that none of these people have, etc. So it's useful in that way, but also just higher economic growth means there's more stuff to go around. It means there's more upside. It means there's more room to expect your own life to improve, and then you don't have to think of improvement in your life coming at the expense of someone else, or to think that if someone else is doing well, it must be because they are in some way exploiting you. So yeah, I do view that as a serious existential risk, and I just happen to be fairly optimistic about the broad future of economic growth. I
Mm.
think my side wins a lot of the social issues over a sufficiently long period. In part because, if people kind of disagree on a lot of norms and values, but also don't have any kids, then their opinions don't matter all that much after a generation or
Oh
two.
my
Like,
god.
it's interesting to hear from them, but they like, does it really matter? Whereas if people are having lots of kids and those kids are growing up with a certain set of norms, like, those are the default norms of the next generation, and they're like the only norms of the generation after that. So, um, yeah, I think these are all tied together, but then they're also just narrower considerations. Like, I like my wife,
Mm.
I like there to be more people like her in the world, and so we've produced some.
Let me ask you, one more question just to kind of tie up the broader themes of the book, which is really like trying to move us out of stagnation and back into the progress mindset. I mean, you talk about this distinction between innovation and progress, and how you think back to the mid 20th century and earlier, there was progress was the word that was on everyone's mind. You can think like the Disney style Tomorrowland carousel of progress. We're progressing towards something, and now you don't hear that as much. It's more about innovation. What what's the importance of that distinction, and like how do we make progress cool and interesting and relevant again?
Yeah. So I would say that you can talk about progress when people broadly agree on what progress is. But if you have people who are, for example, really, really guilty about energy consumption and feel like that is just a net bad thing, then a new abundant source of energy to them is not progress. It's actually regression. Like, we should feel bad about that. Or, like, there's a strongly held hypothesis in some circles that I'm sympathetic to, that we can reverse the temperature impact of climate change through
Mm.
they're basically injecting sulfur into the air, and it inverts some of the effects of CO2, and so offsets a lot of the warming, and it's cheap. And you can actually read news stories where people who are in the climate science and climate activism space will say this is bad because it actually draws attention away from things like degrowth and using fewer fossil fuels. But, like, if the problem with fossil fuels is the global warming, and we fix the global warming, we have fixed the problem. Like, we should celebrate by pouring ourselves a big mug of um kerosene and toasting. We like you want people to be kind of broadly aligned, that, like, it is better for people to have nicer, happier, more pleasant lives. It's better for people to be able to express their agency in the broader world, and if they want something to happen, to be able to make it happen, barring anything that violates somebody else's rights. And so, in that sense, I think a lot of people in the mid 20th century did have this view, because they had seen material progress of their lifetimes. They had seen, what their mother's laundry day was like versus what it's like to put laundry in a washing machine and press some buttons. And it's still manual labor, but it's not literally backbreaking manual labor that just grinds people into the ground. And so they felt like that is clearly progress. But if you've had multiple generations where life has actually been pretty good, and where in material terms your life and your parents' life is not that different, maybe you use DoorDash more than a previous generation did, but it's not like there's a new technology that allowed burgers to be delivered to your home more efficiently. There's a new technology for matching lower wage workers and cheap food to people who don't want to get up in order to eat a meal. Which is, it generates a surplus. Like it's good that it exists. I use it. But it is not the same kind of technology where like you could open your door and see just a wildly different world.
Yeah.
You see basically the same world with these incremental improvements. So I think that is part of what we've lost in that debate. And I think the other thing with innovation is that if we're not saying we're moving towards some goal, we're just saying we're changing something. Well, you can achieve a greater subjective sense of innovation if you just forget things more and don't know very much. And there are sometimes stories in kind of science adjacent popular media that just get recycled over and over. And sometimes it's like a new, really, really efficient solar panel, and like solar panels are getting more efficient over time. But it seems like every couple of years there will be some story about like a 10x improvement, and it's just often just not real, or it is real and it gets there along exactly the cadence you'd expect by looking at the previous experience curve. Or there are just lots of basically one weird trick kinds of solutions that get proposed to various problems, and they often have one glaring flaw that makes them not a very good trick at all. But if you have a short memory, then this does feel novel. It feels innovative. And so that is part of what happens with innovation being a substitute for progress, is having a weaker sense of history means that more stuff feels new when it is actually a recycled failure from before.
Byrne Hobart, what is one question that you think more people should be asking? We ask all of our
Mm.
guests this question, and we like to catch them off guard, but I feel like you have grappled with some very major
Yeah,
ideas in this book. What's one question you
got
think more
this.
people should ask?
Yeah. So, thinking about the natalism question, because I think, there's this kind of, realist cynical view of, hey, the beliefs that people pass on to their kids are the only beliefs that matter over time. But I think there's a broader question of like, how do you know, what do you check to make sure that you are actually pulling in the same direction as society, and that you're actually aligned with things? Is it having a set of norms that is conducive to people having families, to the population persisting, et cetera, is it doesn't actually entail everybody doing that, but it does entail everybody kind of recognizing that this is a really important thing that society does. And I think that's true for a lot of other things, is that we can recognize that something is important and valuable, and that we just personally aren't going to participate in it. And so I think that question of just what does pro-sociality mean today, and how do you actually define it, given that the media ecosystem is kind of insane. There's of course one glaring exception. I'm talking to people at the good publication, but like it is very easy to find lots of crazy narratives, and it's very easy to find lots of very crazy claims about what the average person believes. There are people out there who just earnestly believe all sorts of really nutty stuff, but also believe that this is just conventional mainstream opinion. So I think in some ways we are, we're in a very information enriched environment in the sense that you can learn about anything you want, but a very informationally impoverished environment in the sense of it is very hard to know what the majority of your peers genuinely believe. And we don't have some of the same kind of homogenizing coordination mechanisms. Like it is great to live in a world where there's not like an established church and unestablished range of views and, active censorship of anything considered immoral or whatever. That is like a whole lot better for almost everybody. But it is harder in that one respect, and that is an important respect. And I don't think there's like a really broad solution. I think there's more of an internal contemplation kind of solution to that. But it's something I think about a lot. It's just, are we pulling in? Am I pulling in the right direction? Like how do I know what the actual pro-social equilibrium we're all going towards really is?
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Just Asking Questions. We drop a new episode every Thursday, so if you want to support the work we do, please like and share this episode, subscribe to our new YouTube channel, and follow the show on your favorite podcasting app. See you next time.